The West has a particular way of stripping things down to their essentials. A man discovers what he is worth when the cattle prices drop, and the creditors ride slow and steady toward his gate. A ranch discovers what it is worth when the hands start leaving plates half empty and eyeing the road to town with that long measuring look that means they are calculating distance, not direction. In Montana Territory, in the autumn of 1883, one cattle ranch was discovering both truths at once. The outfit sat in a broad valley between two weathered ridges, the kind of land that looked generous in spring and revealed its indifference by October. 22 men worked it, good men, most of them, the kind who knew the difference between hardship and injustice, and had so far decided this still qualified as the former. But provisions had grown thin, the meat had grown thinner. 3 weeks of salt pork, and not enough of that, had shifted the mood in the bunkhouse from patience to something quieter and more deliberate. The man who owned it all was not unaware. He was many things, proud beyond what his current circumstances warranted, closed off in the way that long loss tends to make a man, and overextended on debts that a territorial creditor in town was no longer willing to pretend did not exist. But he was not a fool. He could read a room. He could read 22 rooms, all of them called faces. His solution arrived at him the way desperate solutions often do, dressed as practical sense, stripped of anything resembling sentiment. He needed someone who could feed the men, someone who could stretch provisions, keep a kitchen, and expect nothing romantic in return. A practical arrangement, cleanly offered and clearly understood. He sent word through a contact in a town 2 days east. A woman was found. Terms were agreed upon. A marriage license was obtained with the same emotional register one might bring to a land survey. She arrived on a Thursday, in the back of a supply wagon that had no particular opinion about its cargo. She was in her mid-20s, slight in frame, but not in bearing, and she carried with her a single small trunk that rode beside her on the wagon bed, with the quiet dignity of something carefully chosen. She had no illusions about what she was riding toward. The man who had sent for her had made no promises beyond the legal name and the roof above it, and she had accepted both with the clarity of someone who has learned to measure an offer against what it actually contains. The ranch did not welcome her. It simply received her the way a table receives a plate, without acknowledgement, without warmth, without curiosity about what might be on it. She stepped down from the wagon and stood in the dust of the yard and looked at the outbuildings with steady, unhurried eyes. A house, a barn, a bunkhouse, a gap in the fence line where something else had once stood. She looked at that gap a moment longer than the rest. The kitchen told her most of what she needed to know before anyone said a word. She stood in it that first evening and let her eyes do the work, not quickly, not with any visible urgency, but with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that a room, honestly examined, does not lie. The shelves held enough to be technically functional and not enough to be anything more. Salt in a cracked crock. A half barrel of flour that had been opened and resealed too many times, the rim of it dusty with old spillage. A side of bacon that had been cut into with no particular plan, leaving angles that would dry wrong. Dried beans in 3 different sacks, none of them labeled, none of them sorted. Lard going stale in a tin. She opened the lard tin, smelled it, and closed it again without expression. She had arrived to feed 22 men on stores that had been assembled with the logic of a man who hoped the problem would resolve itself before he had to think harder about it. It would not resolve itself, It was, in fact, already resolving in the wrong direction. The first morning, she said almost nothing and did almost everything. She sorted, she inventoried, she noted what was salvageable and what had already crossed the line that separates frugal from foolish. The man who owned the house and the name and the roof above, both of them came through the kitchen once, paused in the doorway as though he had forgotten what he was looking for, glanced at her standing among his reorganized shelves, and left without a word. She did not watch him go. The second morning, she walked the property, not because she had been told to, not because she had any authority over the outbuildings or the yard or the fence line, but because she had looked at that gap the evening she arrived, and something in her was not yet finished looking. She moved through the yard at the hour before the hands were fully stirring, when the light came in low and cold from the east and turned everything to long shadows and blue-gray silence. Past the barn, past the grain shed with its smell of dust and old feed, and then behind it, at a slight angle from the main outbuildings, as though someone had placed it where it would not be seen from the house, a structure, small, weathered past gray into something almost silver. Its door was iron-hinged, and the hinge had rusted to a color that matched the wood so closely they had nearly become the same material. She put her hand against the door and applied steady pressure, and it gave, not easily, not willingly, but with the particular resistance of something that has been still for a very long time and remembers being used. The smell that came out was old smoke and dry wood, and something underneath both of those things, something older and fainter and unmistakable. She stood in the doorway and did not move for a long moment. She did not name what she felt. Not yet. She returned to the kitchen before the hands came in for breakfast, and she did not speak of what she had found. Not that morning, not the evening after. She carried the knowledge of the smokehouse the way a careful woman carries something fragile, close and level, and without announcing it. But she watched him. She had learned, in those first days, how to read the landscape of his silences. There were the silences that meant he was thinking about money. There were the silences that meant he was watching the horizon for weather. And there was a different kind, shorter, clipped at the edges, that meant he had already decided something was not worth discussing and had closed the subject before it opened. She waited until the evening of the third day, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, and he was at the table with his ledger, the one he kept for cattle counts and supplies, going over numbers that did not appear to comfort him. She set a cup of coffee beside his elbow without being asked. She did not sit down immediately. Then she did. "There is a structure behind the grain shed," she said. "Small, iron-hinged door, old smoke in the walls." He did not look up from the ledger. "Smokehouse," he said. "Who built it?" A pause, the length of a man deciding how much an answer costs him. "Previous owner, before I bought the property." "How long has it been unused?" 4 years, maybe 5. He turned a page. The numbers on it were smaller than the ones before, which she noted. "Does it still draw?" she asked. She meant the flue, the internal chimney, the way smoke moves up and out when a structure is sound. It was a specific question, the kind a person asks only when they know what the answer would mean. He looked up then. Not long, just a moment, and something moved through his expression that was not quite recognition and not quite suspicion, but occupied the territory between them. "It is not your concern," he said. His voice was not unkind. It was simply closed. She nodded once, looked at the table, looked back at him. "Of course," she said. She rose, cleared her own cup, and went about the quiet work of the evening. He returned to his numbers. The kitchen settled back into its ordinary sounds, the fire banking low, the wind at the single north window, the distant close of the bunkhouse door. She listened to his tone more than she listened to his words, because tone was the thing a person could not entirely control, and his had told her something his answer had not. He knew the smokehouse better than 4 clipped words suggested. He had thought about it. He had at some point considered it and then set the consideration down like a thing he could no longer afford to carry. She understood that. She had set things down before, too. The difference was she had also learned to pick them back up. Tomorrow she would go back. She went back. The morning was iron gray and indifferent, the kind that neither promised nor threatened, and she crossed the yard before anyone stirred in the bunkhouse. The smokehouse door had swollen against its frame overnight. Frost had a way of settling arguments between wood and iron, and she had to lean her shoulder into it with more conviction than the first time. It gave. She stepped inside. 3 days she spent there, not consecutively, but steadily. A few hours each morning while the bread rose, an hour each afternoon while the stew needed no tending. She brought a lantern the second morning, and the light changed everything. The structure was sound. That was the first thing she confirmed, running her palm along the interior walls, pressing the heel of her hand against the stone base of the firebox. The mortar had cracked in 2 places near the vent, but not fatally. The iron hook rack overhead was heavy with old grease and cobwebs, but the iron itself held firm when she tested it with both hands. The hanging rods, 6 of them, had warped slightly, but none had broken. A pair of bellows lay folded in a corner, their leather stiff, but not split. A salt box sat against the far wall, empty and patient. She made no hasty conclusions. She measured and noted. She pressed her fingers into the wood of the floor near the drain channel and found it dry. She studied the way the vents sat, north-facing, which was thoughtful work from whoever had built it, and she opened and closed them 3 times each to learn their resistance. By the end of the second afternoon, she had a list of what the smokehouse was. By the end of the third, she had a list of what it could be. That evening, she did not go to the kitchen immediately. She sat on the low step of the smokehouse in the fading light, her coat drawn close, and she opened the trunk she had carried from her father's house. The ledger was near the top. It always was. She had never been able to bring herself to bury it. The leather was worn at the corners and dark along the spine, where her father's hands had held it open, day after day, year after year. She had not opened it since the morning of her wedding, when she had placed it in the trunk and told herself it was just a record of someone else's life now. She opened it. His handwriting was small and deliberate, the ink slightly faded, but legible. The kind of script a man uses when he knows what he is writing matters. Salt ratios, smoking times, temperatures by season, notes in the margins where a batch had gone wrong or gone brilliantly right, the names of woods, the behavior of heat. She read slowly, the way you read something you already know by heart, but need to hear again in the right voice. Then she took out her own pencil and began her list. The list she made that night was precise. Not a woman's shopping list, not flour and thread and lamp oil. This was the list of someone who had been trained to think in ratios, in weights, in the particular logic of preservation. Coarse salt, measured in pounds, not pinches. Specific hardwoods. She wrote the names carefully, knowing not every hand in a general store would recognize them on sight, and so she noted their grain and color beside each one. iron wire in 2 gauges, burlap undyed, a few smaller items, each with a purpose she did not write down, because some knowledge does not require explanation to those who already understand it.